Hi, Year 11s and 12s. So this is our next little PowerPoint here that we're going to be looking at for unicellular and multicellular organisms. Again, this is part of cell biology. It's all that first week of, you'll see the placement on Doing Science, right, of where this video fits in the great scheme of things of cellular biology. Again, another short little video just talking about what we're going to be discussing here as unicellular and multicellular organisms, and how, when we're talking about unicellular organisms, we're also talking about the functions of life and how the unicellular organisms actually meet that. So let's move straight into that. So unicellular organisms, as that name suggests, unicellular organisms, unicellular, they're organisms that are made up of one cell, uni meaning one, cellular meaning cell, so one-celled organisms. Now, just because they are made up of only one cell, that doesn't mean that they can't carry out all the functions of life in that cell. So they all follow the 7 functions of life that we're about to talk about with Mr. Sheng. So you might have heard Mrs. Gren before when you're in junior primary. Sometimes in secondary school as well you hear Mrs. Gren. But when we're talking IB, we're going to have to use the acronym Mr. Sheng. It's just got that little bit more scientific rigor behind it, rather than movement, things like that. We've got actual proper scientific definitions for that. So the 7 functions of life that unicellular organisms carry out, we'll go in the order of Mr. Sheng. M for Mr. Is metabolism. So living things will undertake essential chemical reactions. So inside a unicellular organism, they are basically going through chemical reactions to keep their life going. So you have aerobic respiration, potentially photosynthesis, things like that all happening inside the cell. Next is R, for in Mr., is reproduction. So living things produce offspring, either sexually or asexually. For unicellular organisms, we're looking at asexually most of the time, and that's going to be through binary fission, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail later on. Moving on to the word Sheng, the S is for sensitivity. Sensitivity is basically living things are responsive to internal and external stimuli. So, for example, in unicellular organisms, they might move around, they might try and avoid colliding with other organisms or move to where sources of food are, etc. The H for homeostasis. They maintain a stable internal environment. Most of the time that's run through their metabolism, or they might be, again, through their sensitivity, moving to a place where there's optimum conditions for them to survive, or good pH, etc. Excretion, they can remove waste products, and we'll talk about how they do that a little bit later, but right now you just need to know unicellular organisms do excrete waste. Nutrition, they can exchange materials and gases with their environment, so take food in to the cell. Again, we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. And growth. They can move and change shape. And as we know, all cells can grow, and when they get large enough, they go through cell division to make themselves small again. We'll talk about that in a video that's coming up this week. So as you can see, most of these unicellular organisms, they're all coming through Mr. Sheng. They're all going and meeting those 7 conditions of life. Many unicellular organisms also have a method of movement. So there might be with flagella that they can move around, etc. But most of them are going to stay fixed in one position. Moving on to an example of a single-celled or a unicellular organism, because the IB does require that you can investigate the functions of life in Paramecium, as well as one named photosynthetic unicellular organism. So it's up for you to find a named photosynthetic unicellular organism. We're just going to go through Paramecium here. You can easily look them up and find another one. There is a video here that we might be able to look at in a second. So Paramecium, they're surrounded by small hairs called cilia, which allows it to move, so that's their responsiveness. Paramecium will engulf food via a specialized membranous feeding groove called a cytosome. That's how they get their nutrition. Food particles will be enclosed within small vacuoles that contain enzymes for digestion. Digestion is a chemical reaction of metabolism. The solid wastes were removed via an anal pore, while liquid wastes are pumped out through contractile vacuoles. So that's how they're excreting. They go through homeostasis by maintaining gas concentration, so essential gases will enter, for example, like oxygen, while carbon dioxide will be expelled. They also, Paramecium, will divide asexually through fission, binary fission, although they can also have horizontal gene transfer, which can occur via conjugation, which is a type of reproduction. So that's our Paramecium, and you need to be able, like I said, state how Paramecium is going to essentially meet those functions of Mr. Sheng, and that's what we have here. Moving on lastly to multicellular organisms, the last slide we'll be looking at in this presentation. Multicellular organisms have properties that emerge from the interaction of their cellular components. So, multicellular organisms, again, these are organisms made up of more than one cell. Their cells will be differentiated, and each cell will have a different function in the body. So, to start with that, we may get a whole group of cells that have the same type of cell grouped together to form what's known as tissue. And then you'll get multiple different types of tissue to form together to form an organ. And then those organs will interact with other organs, creating organ systems which will carry out specific body functions. Those organ systems will collectively together carry out the life functions that we talked about in Mr. Sheng before, so that the whole organism meets the Mr. Sheng requirements. This all happens through cell differentiation, because if we all had the same cells, that wouldn't work. We'd all have one type of cell and be able to produce one type of, for example, maybe you have a muscle cell that's capable of, for example, making your heart beat. But then how would you have other cells, that are going to help you respire, etc. So we need to have cells differentiated to perform different functions. So, for example, red blood cells, they carry oxygen to different parts of the body, whereas a nerve cell is going to transfer electrical messages around the body. So, becoming specialized allows us to have multiple cells that can perform the function of Mr. Sheng more efficiently to ensure that our entire organism runs as efficient as possible.